The Last Cabin in the Arctic Forest. My name is Ethan, and I'm a freelance photographer from Colorado. About 3 years ago, I traveled to northern Norway to photograph the northern lights. I'd spent months planning the trip. My goal was simple: capture the aurora from the most remote location I could find. A local guide suggested a forgotten forest nearly 2 hours outside the nearest town. Before I left, he looked at me strangely and said, "If you find an old red cabin, don't stay there after dark." I laughed. I thought he was trying to scare tourists. I wish I had listened. It was late November. The sun disappeared before 4 in the afternoon. Snow covered everything. There wasn't another car on the road for nearly an hour. Around sunset, my GPS suddenly froze. The screen went black. My phone lost signal at exactly the same moment. I figured it was just the mountains blocking reception. I continued driving. About 20 minutes later, heavy snow forced me to stop. That's when I saw it. An old wooden cabin, red paint peeling from the walls, one small window glowing with warm yellow light. It looked abandoned, yet someone had lit a lantern inside. I knocked. No answer. The door slowly creaked open by itself. Inside, the cabin was strangely warm. There was fresh firewood burning in the fireplace. A kettle sat over the flames, but no people, no footprints, nothing. I called out, "Hello?" Silence. Outside, the wind screamed through the trees. It was already pitch black. Sleeping in my car suddenly felt much more dangerous than spending one night inside. So I stayed. At exactly 2:17 a.m. 3 knocks echoed across the cabin. Knock, knock, knock. Not loud, not aggressive, almost polite. I grabbed my flashlight, walked to the door, looked outside. Nothing, only falling snow. I stepped outside anyway. Fresh snow covered the ground. There wasn't a single footprint, not one, even though someone had clearly knocked only seconds earlier. I convinced myself the sound came from the wooden walls shrinking in the cold. I locked the door, went back to sleep. The next morning, everything looked normal. I spent the day photographing frozen lakes and pine forests. By sunset, I returned to the cabin. Again, no one, just the warm fire already burning. I didn't understand how, but I was too exhausted to question it. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the knocking returned, this time 5 knocks, slow, deliberate. I refused to answer. The knocking stopped. Then something began walking across the roof. Heavy footsteps, crunch, crunch, crunch. Each step moved from one side of the cabin to the other. Whatever it was, it sounded far heavier than a person. I switched off my flashlight, held my breath. The footsteps stopped directly above my bed. Then, a single whisper drifted through the ceiling. It wasn't Norwegian, it wasn't English. It sounded like someone trying to imitate human speech. Every hair on my body stood up. Morning finally came. I packed everything. I wasn't staying another night. As I drove away, I noticed something strange in my side mirror. Someone was standing beside the cabin. A tall figure, completely motionless, wearing what looked like an old winter coat. I slammed the brakes, turned around. Nobody. The figure had vanished. Back in town, I stopped at a small cafe. The elderly waitress looked at my camera. She asked where I'd been shooting. I showed her a photo of the red cabin. Her smile disappeared instantly. She quietly whispered, "That cabin burned down in 1998. I laughed. "No, I slept there for 2 nights." She slowly shook her head. "No one has slept there for almost 30 years. I thought she was mistaken until I opened my camera. Every landscape photo was perfect. The mountains, the frozen lakes, the northern lights, but every single photo of the cabin was missing the cabin completely. Only empty forest remained, as if the building had never existed. I flew back to Colorado the following week. Months later, while editing the photos, I noticed something I'd somehow missed. One image wasn't empty, standing between two snow-covered trees. Far in the background was the same tall figure I saw in my mirror, watching me. Its face was impossible to make out, but one thing was perfectly clear. There were no footprints leading to where it stood. I deleted the photograph immediately. I still haven't gone back to Norway, and every night, at exactly 2:17 a.m. Name is Michael, and I'm from Seattle, Washington. 2 years ago, I traveled to Japan for photography and street documentaries. I'd always dreamed of seeing Tokyo at night, so after spending a week in the city, I decided to visit a quiet mountain town called Okutama. The locals warned me that the last train back to Tokyo was almost always empty. I thought that sounded perfect. I wanted peaceful footage. I had no idea I'd record something I still can't explain. It was just after 11:40 p.m. when I reached the station. There were only 3 people waiting on the platform: an elderly man reading a newspaper, a teenage girl wearing headphones, and a station employee sweeping the floor. When the train arrived, the old man never got on. Neither did the girl. Only I boarded. The doors closed behind me. The platform slowly disappeared into the darkness. The train was spotless. Bright white lights, perfectly clean seats, no graffiti, no sound except the soft humming of the tracks. I chose a window seat near the middle. For the first 20 minutes, everything felt completely normal. Then, I heard it. A little girl laughing, very softly. It came from the next carriage. I smiled. I assumed another passenger had boarded. But when I walked into the next car, it was completely empty. Not a single person. I laughed at myself. Maybe it came through my headphones. Maybe I was just tired. I returned to my seat. 5 minutes later, a tiny voice whispered, "Excuse me," right beside my ear. I jumped so hard my camera fell onto the floor. I spun around. Nobody. Every seat was empty. I picked up my camera. That's when I noticed something strange. The recording light was flashing. I hadn't pressed record. The camera had turned itself on. When I replayed the last 30 seconds, there was only silence until the very end. A child's voice quietly said, "Don't look outside." Every instinct told me to ignore it. But of course, I looked outside the window. There was nothing, just endless darkness. Then, for less than a second, a pale face appeared beside the glass. It wasn't reflected, it was outside, running alongside the moving train, matching its speed, staring directly at me. Then it vanished. My heart was pounding. I hurried toward the emergency intercom. I pressed the button. No answer. I pressed again. Still nothing. Suddenly, the train lights flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. Everything went black for maybe 5 seconds. When the lights returned, someone was sitting at the opposite end of my carriage. A little girl, long black hair covering her face, bare feet, white dress. She wasn't there before. I froze. She never moved, never looked up. The train continued through the mountains. Station after station passed. The doors opened. Nobody entered. Nobody left. Yet she remained exactly where she was. I slowly raised my camera, zoomed in, pressed record. The screen showed an empty seat, no little girl. I lowered the camera. She was still there, watching the floor. I whispered, "Are you okay?" No answer. A few seconds later, without lifting her head, she quietly asked, "Why did you come here?" My throat went dry. I couldn't speak. Then she slowly lifted her face. I wish she hadn't. Her eyes were completely black, not dark brown, not shadowed, completely black, like empty holes. The train suddenly slammed on the brakes. Everything shook. The lights went out again. When they returned, she was gone. Only wet footprints remained on the floor, leading toward my seat, not away from it. Finally, the train arrived in Tokyo. Passengers entered. The noise of the city returned. Everything suddenly felt normal again. I found a security officer and explained everything. He politely smiled, then asked me one question. Which train number? I showed him my ticket. His expression changed immediately. He quietly said, "That service was cancelled 3 years ago." I laughed. I literally just got off it. He didn't respond. Instead, he took me into a small office, pulled up CCTV footage from the platform. The video clearly showed me standing alone, boarding, nothing. No train ever arrived. When the timestamp reached 11:43 p.m., I simply walked off the platform by myself, as if I had entered an invisible train. I flew back to America 2 days later. I never spoke about it again until recently. While cleaning old camera files, I found the recording from that night. The train carriage looked completely empty. No girl, no voices, just silence. Until the final 3 seconds. Someone whispered directly into the microphone, "Next time, don't get off." I deleted the file. But every year, on the same date, at exactly 11:43 p.m., my phone receives an empty voicemail. Duration, 7 seconds, and every time I play it, I hear the sound of a train approaching. My name is Daniel, and I'm from Portland, Oregon. I've always been obsessed with abandoned places, old hospitals, ghost towns, lighthouses. So when I visited Iceland in October 2024, I rented a small SUV and drove along the country's remote eastern coastline. A local fisherman mentioned an abandoned lighthouse sitting alone on a cliff overlooking the North Atlantic. He smiled nervously and said, "If you hear someone call your name, don't answer." I thought he was joking. I wish he hadn't been. It took almost 3 hours to reach the lighthouse. The weather changed constantly. Heavy rain, thick fog, strong winds. By the time I parked my car, the entire coastline had disappeared beneath the mist. Only the lighthouse remained visible. Standing alone above the crashing waves, the building looked abandoned for decades. Rusted metal stairs, broken windows, peeling white paint. But something felt strange. The lighthouse light was still rotating every 15 seconds. The beams swept across the ocean. I entered through the broken wooden door. Inside, everything smelled damp. The spiral staircase creaked beneath every step. I climbed slowly, taking photos along the way. At the top, the lantern room was completely empty. No machinery, no electricity, nothing. Yet, the light outside continued spinning. I convinced myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe a modern beacon nearby. Maybe I was seeing reflections through the fog. Then, my radio crackled. Static. Nothing else. A few seconds later, a calm voice quietly whispered, "Daniel." I froze. No one knew where I was. I hadn't told anyone about this trip. I looked around. Nobody. Only thick fog outside every window. Again, the radio whispered, "Daniel." This time, closer, almost beside my ear. I switched the radio off immediately. The voice continued. That's when I heard footsteps below me. Slow, heavy, metal stairs echoing through the tower. Someone was climbing, one step at a time. I looked down the spiral staircase. Nothing. The footsteps continued anyway, getting closer. I grabbed my camera, started recording. The sound became louder, closer, closer. Then, it stopped directly below the lantern room. Complete silence. I slowly leaned over the railing. No one. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed from the lighthouse door below. Then another. But the footsteps were still directly beneath me, as if someone was standing halfway up the staircase, while another person knocked from outside. My breathing became faster. I decided to leave immediately. As I hurried downstairs, something strange happened. No matter how far I walked, the staircase never ended. I counted over 300 steps. The tower wasn't tall enough for that. I checked my watch. Only 5 minutes had passed. It felt like an hour. Finally, I reached the entrance. The front door was gone. Only a solid concrete wall stood where the exit should have been. I stared in disbelief. Then, the voice returned, much louder. "Daniel!" It wasn't coming through the radio anymore. It echoed from every direction. The lighthouse beams suddenly stopped rotating. Darkness swallowed the tower. Then, someone whispered directly behind me. "You answered." I turned around instantly. Nobody, just empty stairs. Without thinking, I smashed one of the old windows, climbed outside onto the narrow balcony. The wind nearly threw me into the ocean. I carefully climbed down the rusted emergency ladder. Halfway down, I looked up. A person was standing at the very top of the lighthouse, watching me, perfectly still, completely dressed in black. I reached my car, started the engine, drove away as fast as I could. I never looked back. The next morning, I stopped at a small harbor cafe. An old fisherman saw the lighthouse photos on my camera. His face turned pale. He quietly asked, "Did it call your name?" I nodded. He looked down at his coffee, then said something I'll never forget. "Everyone who answers hears it again." I told him. I never answered. He slowly looked into my eyes, then whispered, "You turned around." I flew back to the United States 3 days later. Life slowly returned to normal, until exactly 1 month later. While editing the footage, I noticed something strange. Every time the lighthouse beam passed across the ocean, a human silhouette briefly appeared standing on the rocks below. The figure wasn't there when I filmed, only in the recording. I zoomed in. The face became clearer. It wasn't a stranger, it was me, standing motionless, looking directly into the camera. I immediately closed the video. I never opened it again. But sometimes, late at night, when my phone loses signal, I hear a quiet whisper through the speaker, "Daniel?" And every single time, I resist the urge to answer.